Okay, so let's start the talk for today. I have the pleasure to introduce in the CIUHCT Lecture for today Juan Acevedo, who is a colleague at the Rutter Project, Global Earth. Juan is a PhD from the World Philologies Institute, where he made his work, his research on alphanumeric cosmology, and was published under the title Alphanumeric Cosmology from Greek into Arabic. He's currently a member of the CIUHCT and a member of the Rutter team, the Rutter Project, the ERC Rutter Project, and he is studying the connections between cosmology and epistemological matters in the ocean, ocean navigation, and all the Arabic sources. So one is mainly an Arabist, and today with a very puzzling poster, which we have already seen, we are going to hear his exposition on these matters. Juan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you, Monique, for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here also because I think it will allow me to repay a debt with my own academic path somehow. Because Luis said you can talk about anything. So I took him literally, and I'm going to try and take advantage of my earlier research that brought me here to the attention of the gentleman here, professor, and that really, in one way or another, somehow underlies my current research too, and some of the work I do here, like with the Latin reading group. So that's an additional pleasure to be able to join these threads of my work. And I will, at some point eventually, I will start explaining the poster and the atomic explosion. I know everyone wants to know about that. But my talk has to do with addressing head-on a very banal misconception, a simplification that plagues our understanding of the academic life and of what the university is and of what we are about here. I mean the polarity between these two imaginary terms, science and humanities, as if these two things existed with any clear delimitation, and as if they are actually in some kind of opposition to each other. During this talk, I will take them as they come to us in our daily life. I will not try to debunk them, but I will build from the situation where we are, stuck with these two misleadingly simplistic terms, our two fields, our two areas of knowledge, science and humanities. What I would like to do today is part of a persistent effort actually underway to advocate for the mutual awareness of these two fields. But I would like to take a particular angle. So I will not be bothering you with just another exhortation like, oh, scientists, be good and learn some humanities. Or, oh, you humanists, be good and learn some science. No. There is enough momentum already on this kind of discourse. And for example, I think last year we had here Professor Shady Barch from Chicago. She gave a big lecture at the rectorate, I think. And she, for example, leads this discipline agnostic, as they call it, Institute of the Formation of Knowledge at the University of Chicago, where they try to consistently, merge these apparently different fields of science and humanities in different ways. So I will not be insisting in that particular way, but I will try to dig a little deeper in two ways. One theoretical and one very practical. The theoretical way refers to the fact that both science and humanities share an essential relation with reality, with the world, with the phenomena as we see them, and inside us too. And this relates to the match made in heaven that is mentioned in the title, in the 9 heavens more specifically. But I will leave this theoretical reflection for later on in the talk. The practical way has to do with the methods employed by science and humanities. And my contention that I submit today before you is that science and humanities do in fact share a particular kind of methodology, or that they could or should, and that there is something essentially analogous in the way they produce or they approach knowledge and they produce knowledge. I will try to be just a little provocative. So I will say a few things that may sound outrageous, so do question me on them, yeah? Don't be passive. So what is with this method? This is what I am calling here philology, yes? And I'm trying to expand, not just to speak. Normally when we hear the word philology, we think Greek and Latin, this European tradition of philology. But being our times what they are, I thought it was appropriate to try and expand from beyond our culture too. And this is also nothing new. There are big projects about this. I know some people in Germany, for example, who work on this, what they call World Philologies, yes? So trying to find common ground between different traditions of textual approach. In Europe, so what I mean by this philology here is a sort of basic approach to textual matters that is supposed to be known by every learned person, yes? And we have a word in Europe for that kind of thing, a very old word. It's a trivium. That means the first 3 of these 7 disciplines. Yes, so this is a lovely illustration from a 12th century work. And there was this doctrine, you all know about it, of the Septem Artes Liberales. Was realizing it really is a very lazy translation to say liberal arts. That tells us nothing. So trying to say something meaningful, 7 free disciplines of higher education, that's more or less what it was about. And maybe actually higher education is not also too accurate. Because, for example, the trivium, so what are these? Yes, what is in the picture? Just we have to have a little overview of the picture. At the center of it all is lady philosophy, which really means the effort at acquiring knowledge, at cultivating knowledge. Yes, it's not philosophy as we understand it now exclusively. Yes, philosophy was the name of that central endeavor in the production of knowledge and in the seeking of knowledge. This is why still a remnant of that is that when any of us gets a degree, the highest degree in the university, if it's in engineering or whatever, it will be PhD, Philosophia Doctor. Why philosophy? Well, because it was the center of this hub. Yeah, it was at the hub of this wheel of knowledge. And so what we have here, the trivium, at some point, this is a very old doctrine about the quadrivium, the 4, Plato called them, or Nicomachus of Gerasa, they called them the unmissable, the necessary path to all knowledge. Yes? And it consisted of arithmetic and geometry, and then arithmetic in motion, that's music, and geometry in motion, that's astronomy. So that's a quadrivium. And then at some point later on in the early Middle Ages, this trivium, which also came from a classical education, was added to the mix. And it consisted of the lady on top here, grammatica, rhetoric, and dialectic. Sometimes they call this logic. So logic, grammar, and rhetorics. the interesting thing is that, so my talk would be mainly about the trivium in a way, and of the relation between the trivium and the quadrivium. But the interesting thing is how the trivium was, and this is why I said higher education maybe is not too accurate. The trivium really means the basic education at understanding a body of texts, a corpus that everybody had to have, yes? And of course, it includes some grammar, and it includes the laws of reasoning and the ways of reasoning in logic, and it includes acquiring the faculty of expressing, of communicating knowledge, that's rhetorics. And what has happened to a certain extent is that we are always taking the trivium for granted in higher education. We leave it to our primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, and that's it. So we, depending on the subjects we choose afterwards, we will dig a bit deeper in that or not. We will just continue our career, and sometimes people can get to very high degrees of their scientific careers with a primary school and secondary school level trivium, yes? So that means they really never learned how to discern strictly, rigorously, the import of a text, the quality of a text, the implications of a text. And I will dwell a bit more on the consequences of this later on. It has to do with the atomic explosion. And what I would like to do is speak a little more in detail of the how of the trivium. How does that work? So, meaning what happens in the classroom. The classroom of the trivial classroom, you could say, yeah? The classroom where you study these disciplines that have to do with text and with language, are more like a conversation and a dialogue. And this happens like that across cultures, really. It's found all over. And it cannot be other way, because as this important German philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer put it, true conversation transforms our views. So we could say where we study the trivium, or the humanities, if you will, that should be a place of true conversation. Not just blah, 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 blah. Yeah, true conversation. This dialogue is, in fact, reflected graphically on the pages of the fundamental texts across cultures and through the centuries. Yes, for example, this is a page of the Talmud, where the medieval commentators of the Tanakh, of the Bible, comment on the text at the center here. So all these on the margins are different levels of commentary from different centuries. Yes, and at some point in the High Middle Ages or a little later, it became standardized in this sort of formulation. It became printed later on like that. It's a very typical, very characteristic. So these are centuries and centuries of commentaries. This is a commentary over the centuries on a fundamental text. The center is in Hebrew, and then some of the commentaries are in Aramaic, also written in the Hebrew script. And here, this is a bit more spectacular. This is a page of the Quran. So you have here the Arabic text, and then in Arabic script, this is a Chinese pronunciation. A Chinese pronunciation of, they try to give what would be a Chinese pronunciation of this, and then you have Chinese characters translating the meaning. Yes. So again, a fundamental text and layer upon layer of commentaries. And here, for example, we have this very famous geometry text, Euclid's Elements, and here in particular, Pythagoras' theorem. So it comes from the Greek, but early on it was translated into Arabic, so you have the text here, and then look at someone couldn't help, or had to add commentaries on the margin. In many cases, they would add illustrations, like what happens here. This is, again, same thing in the Greek, in a Greek original. So you have the text here in 2 columns, and all around, commentaries. Yes? So I find this is a graphic manifestation very clearly of this dialogue I am mentioning. Sometimes these commentaries can be very outrageous, very funny, vulgar. We don't have here the little hands. They are very famous, you know, hand pointing. But there are some Greek commentaries. I remember having seen that where when a passage is really spectacular, they put a penis ejaculating on the margin of the documents. So they found it really pleasurable or something. Yeah, so in these commentaries and in this conversation, you also find, and this is something I was speaking about this with Charles Burnett a few days ago. I told him about this talk, and he said, you should tell them about the joy of reading texts like this. Yes? So this is a very important thing. When we are in a classroom working on these original texts, it's always a joy to approach the texts because there is so much there and there's always a lot of new things. But of course, this has its price. All this fun, huh? And the price is really the painstaking acquisition of a set of fundamental elements. Normally in practice, because language is the basic ground of any communication, this initial instruction takes the shape of learning a grammar, meaning learning the morphology and the syntax of a classical language. And so here we have some examples of that painful situation where we find ourselves at the beginning. Yeah, so here are some Sanskrit conjugations and some Arabic and some Greek, pretty much similar situation. And do note, though we won't stop here, how I've used the word instruction for this process. It means that there is a construction in the mind, that a structure or a framework or a scaffolding is set up in the mind of the students, in our minds, the scaffolding inside. But what I mean by this grammar is not just this kind of tables, not just what we study at school, nouns, adjectives, and verbs, etc. But what we should probably call an education in reading, or explaining a little, a curriculum and a method of learning the architecture of meaning, or the semantic meaning, the semantic system that underlies a culture. This is clearer when we compare with other cultures. In Europe, it was always Greco-Latin philology for obvious reasons, historical reasons, with a strong component of Hebrew, occasionally, the biblical language, sometimes Arabic because of its relation with the biblical languages. But nowadays, the world has shrunk. I think as historians, we know that not many things change in history. For example, this similar discussion to what we are having here took place in the 10th century. It's recorded in the works of an Egyptian mathematician, Ibn Daya, Ahmad Yusuf Ibn Daya. He wrote of a conversation where they were wondering if the trivium should be studied in addition to the quadrivium, or if the quadrivium was sufficient. So they had a lengthy discussion about that. Unfortunately, I couldn't get hold of it before I came here today. And you know, for example, we have been discussing in our Latin class about Seneca. You know how you read some of the letters of Seneca and you think you're reading yesterday's newspaper, complaining about the stupidities that politicians do, and you know, etc., etc. So nothing changes too much, but a few things do change. And now the world has, in a certain way, shrunk. Cognitively, we have access to many cultures very easily, to the foundations of many cultures. And in this really new situation, studying other philologies becomes, if not a wish, almost perhaps a must, in order to grasp other cultures from their foundations, in order for us to be able to have real dialogue. The geopolitical realities are always changing, sometimes dramatically. And now there is this impulse to try and repair centuries of European plunder. And it's probably very right to do so. But these efforts will remain superficial and showy unless we make an effort to really understand other cultures from their very principles, not by, again, projecting the problems and the characteristics of our societies onto the other cultures. So we are right now linguistically in a very tricky situation. This is a bit of a parenthesis, because worldwide our scientific communities, we are all inevitably enmeshed in an Anglocentric mental world. Everything conspires to reduce our reasoning and our logic to those of English, with the consequent impoverishment of our worldviews. So we feel that urge to decenter, to globalize our disciplines, but we are bound by the semantic limits of this very particular language I am speaking now. So let's say we want to really open the discussion and aim at some sort of global approach, yes, at cultural understanding. So I ask myself the question, how many traditions of philology are there? Because we can't say that all languages have a full-fledged philological tradition, yes, where you have a very systematic, not only a corpus of literature, yes, of written, or it can be orally transmitted too. Not only that, but a systematic approach, yes, like as it were a meta-discipline, yes, and understanding what's happening there with the language itself. Not many cultures do that. So I consulted with our friend Jeffrey Kotick about that. He has had the opportunity to go into a lot of detail in some of the powerful philological traditions, you know, Tibetan and Chinese. Jeffrey is very steeped into that. And we came up with a list, tentatively, just 15 languages, yes? 15 languages that have such a full-fledged philological tradition that over the centuries have accumulated this, where there is a well-established way of training for people, you know, in the knowledge of the texts themselves and in how to analyze them, yes, how to approach them. So there's Greek, Latin, Sanskrit. Pali is very specialized for Buddhist texts mostly. And then there is Armenian and Georgian. In some of these languages, it's very obvious they have to do with a strong and large religious tradition. It's a case of Armenian and Georgian. Also Coptic, for example. And then there is Persian, Farsi. There is Hebrew and Arabic, Syriac, closely there, Coptic and Ethiopian, and then there is Chinese, Tibetan, and Japanese. Now, some of these are, for different reasons, for different historical reasons, have become very, very specialized. Some are more marginal, and some are more global. Some for linguistic reasons. For example, Sanskrit is the mother of a great many languages in modern India, for example. So some of them, you know, have reverberations that go in many different ways. Japanese, for example, is a very localized language, but Japan itself has a strong international presence because it's a rich country. So there are all these factors, and I was trying to think what are the languages that we want to have here represented in the university, yes, or in any decent university, you know, which of these traditions should we have represented in a decent university, that people could always have access to them? Yes, so I came up with this little list of just 6. And this is a European list. This is why Greek and Latin are there, because as you know, they simply empower us with our own languages. If you study a little of Greek and Latin, then your own language starts becoming transparent. And well, still, as we know well here in this department, there's so much Latin literature in the late and high and late Middle Ages, scientific literature and all sorts of other literature that are still in Latin, untranslated and unstudied just because of the language barrier. So Greek and Latin are there, Sanskrit, and then, well, these are global languages. And actually, I think Japanese should have a question mark there. Maybe because it's so specialized to Japanese culture. But I have a weakness for Japanese because I don't know, I like it very much. And Greek, yeah, maybe. Anyway, I leave you with this list. So if you know anyone who has contacts in the rectorado, maybe some influence. No, in Letras, maybe there are some. Well, we have a Confucius Institute right there across the road. So Chinese is happening there, and there's Greek and Latin, maybe some Sanskrit, we're not sure. It's interesting that these were called, these have been called sometimes languages of science. Because they were used, or some of them, these 4, at some point, without Greek and Japanese, they were called languages of science because they were used until the early 20th century for a lot of the scientific communication in their respective cultures. And for example, languages like Arabic and Sanskrit have always exceeded geographical boundaries. And Arabic, for example, through the Middle Ages, at some point, it was practically the lingua franca of the Mediterranean, just as Latin was the lingua franca north of the Mediterranean for a long time. So, well, languages of science. And now I would like to present just a few examples of texts representative of these different philological traditions. And with these examples, we can have a look at the different kinds of things that happen when you study, or that you can encounter when you engage in these studies. And a little aside, somewhere at the basis of this kind of study, of philological studies if you want, there are 2 principles. A principle of humility that has to do with the passive approach, how we receive things, to receive knowledge, and the principle of pride, and that has to do with the action, with the effort we do to emulate the knowledge and to acquire and to then spread. And when we think of adding philology to science, we have one negative and one positive reason, or we may have. So the negative reason would be the outrages of unschooled science. And the positive reason would be the empowering that philology gives. And in relation to this, here's the story of the lion makers. Yes? So I'll tell you the story of the lion makers. This is from a book of fables we all know. It's as they like to say, it's the greatest book of fables we all know, but we don't know we know. Panchatantra, also in Arabic it was called at some point Kalila and Dimna, is at the basis of many of the fables that then were made into European languages by La Fontaine and others. And there are many of the fables of Aesopus in Greece that are related directly to the Panchatantra. It's a very, very influential text in many ways. And this great Sanskritist, what's the name? Oppenheimer. So I just thought I would bring Oppenheimer because, with the movie was so well received that at least, it would give some appeal to the talk. And this is why the atomic explosion is there. So Oppenheimer, he happened to be a really devoted Sanskritist. The man put a lot of effort. So apparently he went, even when he was working on his physics, he took the time to go evenings to the house of a friend who taught Sanskrit, and they would read together into the night. And he apparently was always quoting Sanskrit stuff. And one of the quotations he liked was to do with the lion makers. So the lion makers are 4 friends that go into the forest one day, and they find, so 3 of them are scholars, highly educated people, and the other is just a childhood friend. The others consider him a bit silly. And they come across the bones of a dead lion. So one of the smart friends looks at them and said, "Oh, I know what this is. It's a lion. I can recognize it from the bones, and I can put them together in their correct order, and we rebuild the skeleton." And wow, yes, let's do that. So they put together the bones. Here you have. And then the second of the friends, of the learned friends, says, "Well, I know this formula, this magic formula that will make the skin and the flesh of the animal grow again. So we will have the lion there." And the third one says, "And I know a formula that will make it come back to life." It almost sounds like, reviving a mammoth from the ADN or something like that. It's in the works. And then the fourth friend says, "But hold on, just, don't you think being a lion, it's a bit dangerous?" Stupid. Really, you should have studied, It's so embarrassing to go around with you. So they put the flesh on the bones, beautiful lion. And then when the other one is about to revive the lion, the fourth one says, "Just hold on for a second, I will climb that tree, if you don't mind." And they laugh at him. Go. So they revive the lion successfully, hooray. And the lion immediately eats the 3 of them. And the fourth friend had to look at how the lion ate his friends. He waits for the lion to go and goes back to his village. So isn't it interesting how that Oppenheimer himself would cite this story? And the conclusion of the story is this. So apparently, actually, this is a whole section of the Panchatantra is devoted to rash judgments. So this being a typical example. And so what you have here in the Sanskrit is, interestingly, this word intelligence, buddhi, it has to do with intellection, you see, and it shows how the word intelligence for us has lost a lot of edge. Yes? So what this fourth friend had that they didn't have was this ability to put his knowledge in the larger plot of things. Not just the information that he had, but to really bring it into his own life. Yes? And this shows, of course, many things, but how science can be compromised when its agents are intellectually weakened. Yes? And then I have this lovely passage of Pliny. We have been reading Pliny here at the moment, Historia Naturalis. Pliny is this great transmitter of all sorts of crazy and not so crazy biological and all sorts of legends of natural sciences in general, from the classical times, with an influence that it's hard to measure, even until maybe 200 or 300 years ago, everybody would start by citing Pliny. What he said about the butterflies, or what he said about the elephants, or whatever topic you start, the meteorology, what Pliny said was like, all right, let's go there first, and we build up from there. Or we correct Pliny. Pliny had a great fortune as someone, everybody wanted to bash Pliny and say he's wrong. But still, they were transmitting him. And so something we found recently when reading Pliny was, he's speaking about the insects. And so he starts his chapter on the insects with a very beautiful apology for the greatness of small things and how the power of nature is at its most in the small things. So that's why he says, we keep going on about elephants and bulls and so on, but really it's in the small things. You should look at a bee, or you should look at an ant, or a lichen, something like that, something very small. And then he comes with this formulation, mihi contuente sem persuasit rerum natura nihil incredibile existimare de ea. As I am contuenti, looking at things intently, yes, it's not just tuenti, contuenti, I'm, close quarters. As I'm doing that job, rerum natura, the nature of things, and this, it always persuades me to never find anything incredible, and nothing is unbelievable that you will find in nature. So this was his conclusion there. Very interestingly, we were commenting when we read this how Pliny very often would say rerum natura, to extol the power of nature and so on. And you can find later on through the Middle Ages exactly the same formulations, just changing the rerum natura for God. So the fathers of the church would come and use exactly the same kind of argument of design, and say instead of rerum natura, they just changed to God. And it worked perfectly theologically. And it kept on going, not just in Latin and in Greek, but also in Arabic, and Hebrew, same arguments. The philosophers would do this, and the theologians would do this. And so one takeaway from this is how even though we have looked a lot into nature, and even though we have looked a lot into the fundamental texts, because the same applies there is always place for the atopon, yes? For the placeless. The atopon is this Greek word like no place. It's something that when you come across it, you're like, ¿Dónde? And this is a great, so coming back to the philological study, this is a great aspect of approaching again and again the fundamental text. There is always something atopon there that can be funny, instructive, or whatever, but you always have to be ready for the unexpected. Even if you're rereading a text that you have read 10 times, there's something there. There are always sparks of insight in these texts that plant a seed in our mind, and this is why we can call a reading group a seminar. It's a place for sowing, for putting those seeds in. It is one of the most rewarding things when you're studying with students this kind of text, is seeing again and again this eureka moment, like, oh, yeah. And then here, an example from the texts we are working in our nautical studies here. Just a very little image. So this image is from a manuscript found at the Biblioteca Nacional. And this is a Google Earth map. So you have, if you rotate this 90 degrees, you can see the similarity of the peninsula. This is Gujarat. This is the peninsula of Kathiawar. And what you have here, these little numbers, are depths in fathoms. So, for example, one kind of study that can be done is historically compare the different measurements. And there you have notes. These are coastline designs with the names of the places, how they will look when you approach the coast. Yes? As we find them in earlier Portuguese rutters, for example, this kind of illustration of the coastline. So this sort of geography compared through the ages makes me think about history. And it's good to just reflect for a second. And it's part of what happens when you are engaging with this text. Because especially since we are in the Department of History of Science, and this is why I didn't want to give to the title of the talk just History of Science, but say science in general. It's good to make clear that history is never only about the past. This is a misconception. History is not chronology, and history is not chronicle. They are part of history. They are a valid and necessary part of history. But history is always and inevitably about the present, too, because the historian is engaged in it fully from within his own time. We do not study history because we are in love with the past or because we want to escape the present out of nostalgia. In the study of history, we touch on the living fabric of human cultures, like a burning ember. What's happening there? The coming to be. This has to be with this idea of the coming to be of the world. This is why it's impossible to separate neatly between philosophy and history. The study of history brings us to philosophical questions from the first moment, just as the study of philosophy brings us to historical questions. And the same applies to other disciplines in relation to philosophy. If a scientist of any discipline has not encountered philosophical questions, it means either he has not gone too far into his studies or he has met those questions and for some reason has not pursued them, but it's inevitable to come across them. So I'm not saying science needs humanities as a whole, but it certainly needs the core of the humanities. And actually just the opposite is true. And this has to do with the relation, again, then between the trivium and the quadrivium. And I would like to come to this image again to elaborate on this. It has to do with the idea that science and philology are both rooted in the phenomena. Yes? And this is why I speak of a match made in the 9 heavens, meaning by that that there is an order in astronomy. There is an order in the observation of the heavens, which was from very early on, from Platonic dialogues and early on from Pythagorean texts related to the basics of arithmetic and the basics of number. The regularity of the celestial movements was from very early on, and it has always been like that, seen as related to number as a pure thing. And grammar also has been always seen as a reflection of a natural order, of a structure. And of course, nowadays, epistemological studies have developed a lot through the centuries, and we can speak in these terms. So the study of language and the study of grammar have a lot to do with nature in this sense of our mental acquisition of nature, the frame of the human mind, the structure of the human mind itself. But in any case, I find this is an explanation that the 7 disciplines are there on a circle. There is no hierarchy there. They are all equidistant from the center, from the central acquisition of knowledge of philosophy. So the match is actually not just made in heaven, or in the heavens, the Ptolemaic heavens, meaning the cosmic order itself, but in every knowable reality. In the abstract of the talk, I had spoken of a dispute. And it was really just to try and make people more interested. And no sparing punches and so on. But because there is a discussion there, people saying, oh no, science, why would it need humanities? And the opposite also. But I think it's probably very clear once you really start engaging with these disciplines how they ignore each other at their own peril. And what are these perils? Is it just fear-mongering? So what is a peril for scientists of not having a proper grounding on the trivium? Well, maybe becoming binary, mechanistic, materialistic, and also for humanities. What is a peril there? Becoming very vapid, vague, detached. Yes? If we engage in humanities with a solid grounding on something, on a system of an approach to the reality. And I think that what has happened is that in general we have come to a situation where on both camps there is a generalized lack of intellectual rigor. And this is how we fall for outrageous science, like let's revive the lion. And this is how we fall into inane philosophies and vain hair splitting also, because of the lack of that basic rigor. So the solution to that, of course, is having access and pursuing philological education. So you can choose between your 15 languages. Yes? No, but what can the offer be? Yes, to empower us to judge, to decide, to tell the faff and the fats from what is vital, what is alive, real. I remember it impressed me very much early on reading Protagoras, Plato's dialogue, where he said, discussing about how bad the sophists were and so on. So there was this question about what is it for that we are learning these things? And he said the whole point of studying literature in these things is to become able to discern a good text from a bad text. Yes. And we never really learn this. So often we can go through many years of education and then just not being able to judge if a poem is good or if a poem is bad. We have, especially in our relativistic times, it's all good, peace and love, yeah? More or less. No, so to conclude, thinking of the possible outcomes of this sort of serious study of the trivium in different traditions. Studying textual traditions like this can give ponderation, weight, to take the weight of things. Yes. And on a more broader view, it can give compassion. It can give compassion in a humane sense, like humanus sum, nihil humanum a me alienum puto. This famous sentence of Terentius. I am human. I don't consider anything human alien to me. So compassion in this sense, not like, oh, yeah, cute. No. And it can raise our awareness of underlying messages, of connotations, of tendencies, suggestions, insinuations, and not to let us be petty, but broad-minded. And this I have seen in the people I have studied with, who have been for many years engaging in this kind of study. One of the traits of the teachers I have had of philology in different fields is this amazing capability to listen to others. And far from any kind of pettiness, just listening and trying to understand. And this is probably one of the greatest benefits of a proper grounding in a philology is being able of a rigorous analysis in conversation, of disputation in a good sense. Yes, to engage with other people, to fight with them, to discuss something, and yet, not becoming not killing each other, but actually producing new knowledge from that, from the discussion and from the distasteful discussion. Yes, but there is a text at the center that we all want to understand. and we struggle about that, and we have different opinions, and yet, at the end, oh, yeah, we can go and have a cup of coffee and get ready for the next lesson. Or we can, you know, as very often happens, we can try and understand the text, and we don't, because it's difficult, and we go out of the classroom feeling beaten by the text. You know, this happens very often when reading Aristotle, this kind of thing. You go out of the classroom and you felt like, you know, you've been beaten for 2 hours. But then the next time, you realize your understanding changed a bit, and you find it, or you get to other text that is a bit easier, and you have flexed your muscles. You know, it has a lot to do with, it's like gymnastics. So this is why I thought at some point when I was preparing the talk that the measure of science is a good description for what happens when we have a proper, rounded education in the trivium and the quadrivium. We are trained in a very slow reading, deliberately very slow reading. And this reading and this conversation that thrives around this reading gives the measure of science. Yes, the depth and the width of science, really. And science in a broader sense. And, you know, I think maybe now we can see how this philosophia at the center, she can be called science. You know, it's meaning this endeavor to know and know and know more. And the same happens, it's not just in this kind of thing. If you are engaged in lab work or in field work dedicatedly and passionately, this also gives the measure of science. These are things also based in a rigorous approach to reality. So I'm hoping that, we got a little taste of what this measure of science might be. Thank you very much.